the frost that wouldn't break. Now, I want to tell you about a man who had everything except the one thing that mattered. February frost coated the Pierce Ranch like a second skin. It clung to the fence posts, glazed the barn roof silver, and crept along the window panes of the grandest house in Calder County. The morning sun touched the ice and made it sparkle beautiful, if you didn't know better. But beauty without warmth is just decoration. And Jonathan Pierce had learned that lesson 8 months ago. The day his wife Catherine died, he stood at the parlor window, coffee growing cold in his hand. Behind him, the room stretched wide and handsome polished wood floors, velvet curtains shipped from Denver, a stone fireplace big enough for a man to stand in. A grandfather clock from Philadelphia ticked in the corner, counting seconds that nobody in this house cared to measure anymore. Every comfort money could provide filled these rooms: crystal oil lamps, leather-bound books, a piano from Boston that had arrived 3 months ago in a crate lined with velvet and sat untouched against the far wall, with its lid still closed, and silence. Lord, the silence. His twin daughters sat on the rug beside the cold hearth. Emma and Rose, 6 years old, their dark hair braided neat by the housekeeper's dutiful hands. They didn't play, didn't quarrel, didn't laugh. They sat like two small birds with clipped wings, staring at nothing particular, holding nothing particular, wanting nothing at all. Jonathan had tried everything a wealthy man could try. He'd bought porcelain dolls from St. Louis still in their boxes by the bedroom wall, tissue paper, undisturbed. A spotted pony named Biscuit stood untouched in the paddock, growing fat on hay and loneliness. Piano lessons were offered and declined with silence. Picture books lay where he'd placed them, spines uncracked. A trip to the traveling circus in Cheyenne had produced 2 hours of the twins sitting quietly on a bench, while other children shrieked with joy around them. He'd even ordered a music box from San Francisco that played Beautiful Dreamer, Catherine's favorite, and when he wound it for them, both girls had simply left the room. He'd spent more money in 8 months trying to make his daughters smile than most men earned in 5 years of honest work. Not one smile, not one. He crossed to the kitchen, boots heavy on the floorboards. Catherine's cookie jar sat on the high shelf, blue ceramic with a chipped lid, painted with tiny yellow flowers she'd picked out from a catalog the year they married. She'd filled that jar every Sunday, without fail. Sugar cookies, molasses snaps, ginger rounds that made the whole house smell like Christmas morning. The girls used to stand on tiptoe, reaching for that jar, giggling, flour dusting their noses, Catherine laughing and pretending she couldn't see them, stealing from the bottom. Jonathan touched the lid, Dust came away on his fingers. 8 months of dust. Nobody had opened it since Catherine's hands last closed it, and nobody had the heart to move it from the shelf where she'd always kept it. Tomorrow was Valentine's Day. His foreman, Bill Hensley, had suggested a small gathering for the ranch hands, something to lift spirits through the tail end of a hard winter. Jonathan didn't much care about spirits, but he needed a cook for the occasion. Mrs. Avery, his housekeeper, managed the house well enough, but feeding 20 working men required different hands and a bigger kitchen operation. He wrote the notice himself and pinned it to the board outside Tillman's General Store that afternoon. Temporary cook needed. Pierce Ranch. Valentine's Day. And onward as required. Fair wages. Inquire at ranch. Jonathan Pierce didn't know it yet, couldn't have known, but those 12 words were about to change 4 lives forever. He rode home in the bitter cold. The frost hadn't broken in weeks. The whole valley sat locked under ice, rigid and waiting, as if the land itself had forgotten that spring was something that could happen. Inside the house, 2 little girls sat exactly where he'd left them, silent, still, frozen in a grief too big for their small bodies to carry. Jonathan knelt before them on the parlor rug. He held out a carved wooden horse he'd bought in town, painted red, with a real horsehair tail, crafted by old Mr. Kimball, who was known across 2 counties for his toy making. Emma looked at it, looked through it, set it down beside the music box, the picture books, and 6 months of untouched gifts piled against the wall like a small monument to everything money couldn't fix. Rose turned her face to the window where frost grew thick as lace across the glass. Jonathan closed his eyes. His hand, still holding the red horse nobody wanted, dropped slowly to his knee. "I don't know how to fix this," he whispered. "Catherine, I don't know how." The hearth fire had gone out sometime during the day. He hadn't noticed, neither had the girls. The 3 of them sat in the cold room together, surrounded by beautiful things, and the silence pressed down on the house like snow on a roof that's been bearing weight too long. A widow at the door. Sarah Martinez arrived at the Pierce Ranch on Valentine's morning with a thin coat, mended gloves, and the kind of posture that says a person has been knocked down plenty of times, but never once stayed there. She'd walked 3 miles from town in the cold. Her boots were cracked at the soles where she'd patched them twice with leather scraps, and her breath came in white clouds that vanished before they reached the porch roof. But her eyes were steady and her chin was level, and she climbed those porch steps like a woman who had earned every right to stand wherever she chose to stand. She carried 1 small bag. Everything she owned fit inside it: 2 changes of clothes, a bar of Castile soap wrapped in brown paper, a wooden comb missing 3 teeth, and her late husband Miguel's recipe for Mexican wedding cookies, written in his careful hand on paper worn soft as cloth from being folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone white. 2 years since Miguel died. 2 years of other people's kitchens, other people's messes, other people's families gathered around tables where Sarah served the food and ate alone afterward in whatever corner was offered. She'd stopped setting 2 coffee cups in the morning about 6 months back. The habit had taken longer to break than she'd expected. Jonathan met her at the kitchen door. He was taller than she'd expected, broader in the shoulders, with a kind of face that had been handsome before grief carved deep lines into it. His eyes held that look. She recognized the one that says, "I'm still standing," but only because sitting down feels like giving up entirely. "Mrs. Martinez." "Yes, sir. I'm here about the cook position." He showed her the kitchen. It was twice the size of any she'd worked in, a cast-iron stove, big enough to roast a whole hog, copper pots hanging from ceiling hooks, a pantry stocked deeper than Tillman's store. Sarah ran her practiced eye across the workspace, noted the well-seasoned skillets and the good ventilation from the high windows, and nodded. She could feed 20 men from here without breaking stride. "The work's straightforward," Jonathan said. "Meals for the hands, starting today. Mrs. Avery handles the house." He paused at the parlor doorway, and something in his voice changed, grew quieter, more careful. "My daughters are in there. They don't talk much anymore. Haven't for a while." Sarah looked past him into the parlor. 2 small girls on the rug, dark braids, dark eyes, hands folded in their laps like little old women in a waiting room, sitting patient for something that was never going to arrive. Sarah stopped mid-step. Her hand found the door frame. She knew that silence. She had lived inside it for a full year after Miguel died, a silence so heavy it pressed the air from your lungs and the color from the world. She'd cooked through it, cleaned through it, walked 3 miles to work and 3 miles home through it, until one morning she woke up and realized she'd forgotten the sound of her own laughter. It had taken her another 6 months to find it again, and even then it came back changed, quieter, with an ache underneath, like a bone that healed but still knows rain is coming. "How long?" she asked. 8 months. Sarah nodded slowly. She turned back to the kitchen and unpacked her bag on the table. Her hands found Miguel's recipe card, and she set it on the counter beside the blue ceramic cookie jar on the high shelf. She touched the jar's chipped lid. Dust, fine and settled, a long time empty. "This was their mother's." "Yes, ma'am." Sarah looked at the jar, looked toward the parlor where 2 small ghosts sat perfectly still on a rug, surrounded by untouched toys. Something turned over inside her chest, something that hurt and healed at the same time. The way pressing a bruise tells you the blood is still flowing underneath. Now, what Sarah did next, she didn't ask permission. She didn't check with the housekeeper, or wait for Jonathan's approval, or follow any of the rules that a hired cook in a wealthy man's house was expected to follow. And I reckon that's what made all the difference. Heart-shaped flower. Jonathan watched from the hallway, barely breathing. Sarah had pulled flour, sugar, and butter from the pantry without a word to anyone. She'd found Catherine's rolling pin in the bottom drawer, the one with the worn maple handles, smooth from years of use, and set it on the kitchen table alongside a tin of cookie cutters shaped like hearts, stars, and half moons. She worked with the quiet efficiency of a woman who has spent her life in kitchens that belong to other people, moving through the space as if her hands already knew where everything was. She didn't call the twins, didn't coax or beg or crouch down with that careful, pitying voice adults use on grieving children. She just started working, measuring flour into a heavy crockery bowl, cutting cold butter into it with a fork, humming something low and tuneless that barely reached the parlor but drifted through the house like wood smoke. The twins sat in their usual spot by the cold hearth, but Emma's head had turned just slightly, just enough, toward the kitchen where flour dust was catching the afternoon light through the high window like tiny stars suspended in amber. Sarah talked while she worked, not to the girls, not to anyone in particular, just talked, the way a person does when they're comfortable in a kitchen and the silence needs filling with something warm. She told the flour about her mother's hands, how they were always dusted white from wrist to elbow, how her mother could tell the weather by the way dough rose slow and reluctant before rain, eager and billowing before a dry spell. Rose stood up from the parlor rug. Jonathan pressed himself flat against the hallway wall, his heart hammering in his throat. Rose walked to the kitchen doorway on bare feet and stood there, watching, one hand on the door frame, ready to retreat. Sarah didn't look up. She kept rolling dough smooth and even across the floured table, kept talking softly about her mother's kitchen in Tucson, where the walls were adobe and the light came in gold through small square windows. She picked up a heart-shaped cookie cutter and pressed it into the pale sheet of dough with a satisfying thunk that echoed in the quiet kitchen. Emma appeared beside her sister, two small figures in the doorway, shoulder to shoulder, watching this stranger do something their mother used to do in this very room. Sarah held out the cookie cutter, not to either girl in particular, just held it out over the table, the way you'd offer water to a shy animal. No sudden movements, no expectations, no disappointment waiting behind the offer if it was refused. Emma's hand came forward, small, hesitant, trembling slightly. Flour-dusted fingers closed around the tin heart. Rose followed without being asked. She took the half-moon cutter from the table and held it against her chest like something precious. 3 pairs of hands worked the dough, Sarah showed them how to press firmly, how to twist gently and lift clean, how to lay each shape on the baking sheet with space between for spreading. She talked about the dough's patience, about how the oven had its own temperament and you had to learn its moods, about how cookies, like people, need exactly the right amount of warmth to become what they're meant to be. Nobody spoke, but the silence had changed. It wasn't the frozen silence of the parlor, that heavy, airless thing that pressed down and held everything still. This was the warm silence of hands doing something together, the kind of quiet that holds people close instead of keeping them apart. Then Rose hummed. A melody, 4 notes, barely there, soft as a breath against the back of your hand. A song Catherine used to sing while braiding their hair before bed. Jonathan gripped the door frame until his knuckles went white. His jaw clenched. His eyes burned. He pressed his forehead against the cool wood of the frame and breathed slow, deliberate, controlled, because if he made a sound, if he moved, if he did anything at all, this fragile miracle might shatter like frost under a boot. It wasn't laughter, not yet. But it was the first sound either of his daughters had offered the world in 8 months, and it came from a kitchen where a poor widow with mended gloves stood with flour on her apron, doing what no amount of money had been able to buy. When my husband died, Sarah sat on the kitchen floor, not because she had to. There were chairs enough, good solid oak chairs with carved backs, but because the twins were small, and Sarah believed in meeting people where they were. You can't reach a child by talking down to them. You reach them by getting low, by making yourself the same size as their world, by showing them that the floor is nothing to be ashamed of. Emma sat cross-legged to her left, pressing cookie cutters into scraps of leftover dough with serious concentration. Rose sat to her right, arranging heart shapes on the baking sheet with the precision of a jeweler setting stones. The afternoon light through the kitchen window was thin and golden, stretched long by the low winter sun. The stove ticked with warmth. Flour dusted the floorboards like early snow that had wandered inside to get warm. "You know," Sarah said, not looking at either girl, her hands busy shaping a piece of dough, "when my husband died, I stopped smiling too." Emma's hands went still on the dough. "His name was Miguel. He was a good man, the best I ever knew. Worked hard, laughed easy, had these big hands that could gentle a wild horse or hold a baby bird without crushing it." Sarah smoothed the dough between her palms slowly. "When he died, the whole world went quiet, like somebody blew out every candle in every room all at once. That's what it felt like. Just dark and still." Rose looked up from her cookie sheet, her dark eyes so like her father's, deep and serious, held something Sarah recognized immediately. Not just grief, the loneliness of grief, that terrible, isolating feeling that nobody else in the whole world knows what this specific silence sounds like, that nobody else is standing in this same darkness. I stopped cooking, Sarah continued quietly. Stopped singing, stopped going to the window to watch the sunrise. Because Miguel and I used to watch it together every morning. And watching it alone felt worse than not watching at all. I thought if I just stayed real quiet, if I didn't move too much or feel too much, the missing him wouldn't hurt so bad. She paused. The stove ticked. A log shifted in the firebox with a soft crumble of ember. Then one morning, I was kneading bread, just going through the motions, hands in the dough, not really thinking about anything, and I remembered how Miguel used to steal pieces of raw dough when I wasn't looking. A smile crossed her face, involuntary and real. He'd pinch off a piece and eat it right there, and I'd scold him something fierce, and he'd just laugh with his mouth full, every single time. Emma whispered, "What happened then?" It was the first word either twin had spoken to anyone outside this family in 8 months. Sarah felt it land against her heart, like a bird settling on a branch. It wasn't sure it could hold its weight. Then I realized something, Sarah said gently. I realized he'd want me to remember the happy times, not just cry. The people we love, the people we lose, they don't want us to stop living. Sweetheart, they want us to carry the good memories forward. The cookies, the laughter, the flower fights in the kitchen. That's what they'd want us to keep alive. Rose's voice came small and careful, like something fragile being unwrapped with trembling hands. Mama used to make cookies too. Did she now? Sugar cookies with cinnamon on top. She let us sprinkle it. I'll bet they were wonderful. Emma pressed closer, her shoulder touching Sarah's arm. Did your husband like cookies? Sarah's eyes filled, but she smiled the kind of smile that holds tears and joy in the same cupped hands, refusing to let either one fall. He loved them, especially the ones I burned. He said those were the ones with the most character. A tiny sound escaped from Rose, a breath that caught and released. Not quite a laugh, but close. Closer than anything had come in 8 months. Emma picked up a cookie from the baking sheet, a lopsided heart, slightly cracked along one edge, dusted white with flour. She placed it in Sarah's hand with both of hers, carefully. The way you'd hand someone something sacred. This one's for your husband, Emma said. In heaven, so he knows we're remembering the happy times too. Sarah closed her fingers around that small, imperfect heart and could not speak. Her throat closed and her vision blurred, and she held that cookie like it was the most precious thing anyone had ever given her, because it was behind her in the hallway. Jonathan Pierce pressed his fist hard against his chest. His breath came ragged through clenched teeth. He gripped the wall with his other hand and squeezed his eyes shut, because a stranger, a poor widow he'd hired that very morning, was reaching his daughter's in a place where his love and his money and his desperate trying had never been able to go. Laughter like water. Now, I need you to understand something about what happened next, because I've told a lot of stories in my time, and this moment, this is the one that gets me every single time. By evening, the kitchen looked like a flour mill had exploded inside a candy shop. White powder covered every surface, the table, the floor, the windowsill, the front of Sarah's apron, the twins' hair, their cheeks, their ears, their small, determined fingers. Cookie sheets lined the counter, 3 deep, crowded with hearts and stars and half-moons in every size, some decorated with sugar frosting that Sarah had mixed from powdered sugar and fresh cream, tinted pink with a few drops of beet juice. The twins were giggling, not the polite, careful sounds children make when they're trying to please an adult or when they think someone expects them to be happy. This was real laughter, the kind that starts somewhere deep in the belly and bubbles up through the chest and bursts out before you can catch it. The kind that makes your sides ache and your eyes stream and your whole body vibrate with the sheer, unreasonable, unstoppable joy of being alive on a winter evening in a warm kitchen with flour on your nose. Rose had pink frosting smeared across both cheeks and was chasing Emma around the kitchen table with the frosting spoon, and Emma was shrieking and dodging and grabbing fistfuls of flour to throw back. And Sarah was standing at the stove pretending to scold them both, while her own laughter kept breaking through. Now you two are making a bigger mess than a spring flood through a dry wash. Sarah managed between breaths. Your poor Mama's kitchen looks like Mama would laugh, Emma declared, spinning past with flour in her hair. And she said it easily, naturally, brightly, the way a child mentions a parent who is loved and remembered and present in spirit, not mourned and avoided and whispered about in careful tones. I reckon she surely would, Sarah agreed, and her voice was warm as fresh bread. The twins peppered Sarah with questions, rapid fire, tumbling over each other, tripping on their own words the way children do when a dam breaks and 8 months of unspoken thoughts come flooding out all at once. Did she like horses? Had she ever seen real mountains with snow on top? What was her favorite color? Could she French braid? Did she know any songs in Spanish? What did tortillas taste like? Could she come back tomorrow? Could she come back every day? Jonathan stood in the kitchen doorway. He'd come down the hall to check on supper preparations. What he found instead was his daughters. His silent, frozen, grief-hollowed daughters alive, their cheeks flushed pink, their eyes bright as creek water in sunlight, their voices filling the kitchen the way spring melt fills a dry creek bed, rushing, tumbling, impossible to contain. The sound of their laughter hit him like something physical. It struck him square in the chest, and his hand found the door frame and his knees almost went because he had been so afraid, so privately, desperately, silently afraid that he would never hear this sound again, that the silence had become permanent, that his girls had gone somewhere he couldn't follow, and they were never coming back. He wept, standing in that doorway with flour dust in the air and the smell of baking sugar and the sound of his children's laughter ringing off every wall. Jonathan Pierce wept openly and without shame. He didn't turn away. He didn't try to hide it. He stood there and let it come, 8 months of frozen grief, cracking open like river ice in the first real thaw. Emma found him. She took his hand, her small flour-covered fingers wrapping around his rough, calloused ones, and pulled him into the kitchen with surprising strength. "Papa, try Miss Sarah's cookies." She held up a lopsided heart, generously frosted in pink. "They taste like Mama's." Jonathan looked at Sarah Martinez across the flour-dusted kitchen, a poor widow in a borrowed apron, standing beside his dead wife's stove, holding his daughter's laughter in her capable, work-roughened hands. She met his eyes, and in that look was everything gratitude, deeper than words. The shared recognition of two people who know what grief costs, and the first fragile thread of something neither of them was ready to name. Catherine's cookie jar sat on the counter behind Sarah, full, overflowing with heart-shaped cookies, their edges touching, their frosting still glistening. 8 months empty, full now. That night, for the first time since June, Jonathan Pierce tucked in 2 smiling girls. He pulled the quilts up to their chins and kissed their foreheads and stood in their bedroom doorway, watching them settle into sleep the way children are supposed to, peacefully, easily, with the day's joy still warm on their faces. Rose pressed her cheek against the pillow and murmured, already half dreaming, "Papa, can Miss Sarah come back tomorrow?" He said yes before his heart finished asking. The weeks that bloomed. She came back and back and back again. Jonathan found reasons the way a river finds its way downhill, naturally, inevitably, following the path of least resistance towards something it was always going to reach. The ranch hands appreciated her cooking. The pantry needed reorganizing before spring supply orders. The root cellar wanted sorting. Reasons that fooled absolutely no one, least of all Mrs. Avery, who pressed her lips into a thin line but held her tongue, least of all Sarah, who understood exactly what was happening and stayed anyway, because 2 little girls needed her, and if she was being honest with herself in the quiet hours before dawn, she needed them right back. The weeks unfolded like something thawing from the inside out. Late February softened into early March, and the Pierce household softened with it. Sarah's rhythms became the heartbeat of the homebred rising before first light. Coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, bedtime stories told in a voice that wove English and the gentle music of her mother's Spanish into something warm and new. Rose started singing again, small songs at first. Half-remembered melodies she hummed while helping Sarah knead dough at the kitchen table. Then louder, then with words. One morning, Jonathan heard her singing to Biscuit in the paddock, and the spotted pony stood perfectly still, with his ears pressed forward, as though he too had been waiting 8 months for someone in this family to make a joyful sound. Emma drew pictures, constantly, ravenously, as if her hands were catching up on all the creating they'd missed. The kitchen table became her studio, papers everywhere. Colored pencils Sarah had bought from Tillman's with her own wages. Horses and houses and sunsets and always people. One evening, Emma held up her latest work for the whole kitchen to see 4 figures holding hands in front of a house with smoke curling from the chimney. She'd labeled them in her careful, lopsided letters: Papa, Emma, Rose, Miss Sarah. She pinned it to the wall beside Catherine's cross-stitch sampler that read, "Home is where the heart rests." Jonathan saw it and could not speak for a full minute. He watched Sarah from a distance that grew shorter by the day, not watching the way an employer watches a worker, but the way a man watches someone he's beginning to understand he cannot live without. He noticed how her hands moved when she braided the twins' hair, patient, gentle, certain. How she listened to their stories with her whole body, leaning forward, eyes focused, asking the kinds of questions that made a 6-year-old feel like the most important person in the territory. One Tuesday afternoon, Rose tripped on the porch step and scraped her knee raw. She was crying, the breathless, hiccuping kind, and Sarah was there before Jonathan could cross the yard. She knelt on the porch boards, took Rose's small leg in her hands, and cleaned the scrape with a damp cloth while humming the same low tune she'd hummed that first afternoon with the cookie dough. Rose's crying slowed, stopped. She leaned her head against Sarah's shoulder and sighed. Sarah kept humming, one hand smoothing Rose's hair, utterly unhurried, as if this child's scraped knee was the only thing in the world that needed attending to. Jonathan stood by the barn with his hand on a fence post and realized his chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with grief. He was staring. He made himself stop. Then he stared again. He fell in love the way rivers carve stone, not all at once, but with a force that couldn't be stopped or redirected. Sarah knew. She couldn't not know. Her hand lingered a half-second too long when passing him the breadbasket at supper. She checked her reflection in the dark kitchen window before he came in for evening coffee, smoothing her hair with quick, self-conscious fingers she'd have denied if anyone asked. Some evenings, after the twins were in bed, They sat on the porch in separate chairs, with a careful distance between them, talking about small things, the weather turning, the price of flour, how Rose was learning to whistle, while the real conversation happened in the silences and the things they didn't say. But Sarah knew her place. She was the hired help. She was poor. She was a Mexican widow in a territory where such things mattered to people with opinions and parlor rooms in which to share them. 3 walls stood between her heart and his. She'd lived long enough to know that wanting something with everything you had didn't always mean you got to keep it. Then, Mrs. Avery found Jonathan in his study one evening, her mouth set firm. "I ain't saying it's right, Mr. Pierce. I'm saying it's what's being said. People in town are talking. Mrs. Caldwell has mentioned it twice at the church auxiliary. A woman of her station, living under your roof this long." She paused, and something complicated crossed her face. Duty warring with what might have been affection. "I like her fine. The girls have come alive again, and I got eyes to see that. But I'd be failing you if I didn't say what needs saying." Jonathan stiffened. The warmth he'd been feeling for weeks met something cold and hard from outside these walls. And for the first time since Valentine's Day, the frost crept back in. The proper match. Mrs. Caldwell arrived on a Tuesday in early March, uninvited and immovable, with her daughter Adelaide arranged beside her in the carriage like a gift being delivered. Adelaide Caldwell was 23, honey blonde, educated in Boston, and possessed of the kind of careful beauty that came with a dowry substantial enough to purchase half the county and still leave change for a European tour. She wore lavender kid gloves and a traveling dress that cost more than Sarah earned in 6 months. She smiled at Jonathan with practiced warmth as she stepped down from the carriage. "We've been so worried about you and those precious girls," Mrs. Caldwell announced, settling herself into the parlor's best chair as if the furniture had been expecting her. "A man in your position, Jonathan, you need proper support around you. Family support." Adelaide produced a porcelain music box as a gift for the twins. She wound the key, and it played a tinkling waltz. "I chose it myself," she said, and her smile was genuine enough, the smile of a young woman trying hard to be kind in a situation her mother had engineered. "I thought they might enjoy it." Emma accepted the music box politely. She held it the way you hold something you've been taught to be grateful for. Rose stood beside her sister without touching it. Their faces had gone still, not hostile, not rude, simply closed, like windows shuttered before a storm everyone can see coming. When Adelaide reached for Rose's hand, both girls stepped backward together, instinctive, synchronized the way only twins can be, and didn't stop moving until they found Sarah standing quiet in the kitchen doorway. Rose gripped Sarah's apron. Emma pressed herself against Sarah's hip. Their bodies made the choice their words were too young to articulate. The frost that had left their eyes weeks ago flickered back when Sarah wasn't near, and vanished entirely when she was. Jonathan watched it happen. Adelaide's confused, slightly hurt smile, Mrs. Caldwell's mouth tightening like a purse string being drawn closed, his daughters' small bodies choosing with the honest, inarguable certainty that only children possess exactly where in this world they felt safe. That evening, the house was quiet again, but a different quiet than before. The quiet of a man sitting alone in his study with a decision pressing against his ribs from the inside. Catherine's ring lay on the desk. He'd taken it from the cedar box in his bureau drawer 11 days ago and had carried it in his vest pocket every day since. The small gold band warm against his chest. Beside the ring on the desk lay Mrs. Caldwell's calling card, cream-colored, embossed, smelling faintly of lilac water, and through the open study door, visible down the hallway, the blue ceramic cookie jar sat on the kitchen shelf full, warm, alive in the lamplight. The ring, the calling card, the cookie jar. 3 objects, 1 choice. His dead wife's family would disapprove. He could hear Catherine's mother, already the sharp intake of breath, the carefully worded letter expressing concern for the children's social prospects. The town would whisper. Mrs. Caldwell would make certain every parlor in the county heard about the millionaire rancher who married his Mexican cook. His daughters would carry that whisper into schoolrooms and church pews and birthday parties for years. But then he thought about the silence. 8 months of it. The untouched music box from San Francisco. The spotted pony standing alone. The cookie jar thick with dust. He thought about every dollar he'd spent trying to purchase his daughter's smiles, and how a woman who walked 3 miles in cracked boots with a dead man's recipe in her pocket had done, in one afternoon, what his fortune couldn't accomplish in 8 months. Here's what Jonathan Pierce never told a single living soul. He'd been rehearsing words in front of his shaving mirror for a week. Not business words, not the confident, practiced language of a man who negotiated cattle prices and land deals without breaking a sweat. These were different words, harder words, the hardest words a proud man ever has to learn, because they require him to admit that everything he built and earned and accumulated amounts to exactly nothing compared to a woman with flour on her hands. The most valuable thing money cannot buy is someone who makes your children smile. 3 days. He needed the words to be exactly right. He would get 1 chance, and he would not waste it on anything less than the truth. In the kitchen, by the light of a single lamp, Sarah packed her small bag. She folded her 2 dresses neatly, wrapped her soap in brown paper, placed her comb along the side, Her hands found Miguel's recipe card, and she held it for a moment, that familiar paper, soft as cloth, before tucking it inside, removing herself from the kitchen, from the cookie jar, from the family, from the dream she'd been foolish enough to let grow roots in soil that didn't belong to her. She'd been the help before. She knew how these stories ended for women like her. Her bag sat by the back door, small, dignified, containing everything she owned and nothing of what she wanted. Papa, we want Miss Sarah. March 14th came in cold, but with something different. Underneath the chill, a softness in the wind, a give in the frozen ground, the faintest smell of wet earth beneath the snow. Spring wasn't here yet, but it was leaning close. It was pressing its face against the window. The twins found their father in his study that morning. They came together, holding hands, solemn and straight-backed and brave in the way that only small children can be brave, without calculation, without hedging, without any of the complicated arithmetic adults perform before they'll risk saying what they feel. Rose nudged Emma. Emma squared her narrow shoulders, took a breath, and spoke. Papa, we want Miss Sarah to be our new mama. Jonathan's pen stopped on the ledger page. A drop of ink bloomed on the paper like a small dark flower. We love her, Emma continued. Her voice didn't waver. She makes the cookies, and she braids our hair right, and she knows the song Mama used to sing. She didn't try to be Mama. She's just Miss Sarah, and we love her, Rose added quietly. She makes the hurt go quieter, Papa, like Mama would have wanted someone to do. Jonathan set down his pen. He looked at his daughters, 6 years old, flowers still under their fingernails from yesterday's baking, standing before him with their hearts wide open and their small hands clasped together. They'd been speaking the truth since the day they stopped talking, he realized. Their silence had been saying what they couldn't. We need someone who understands this grief. We need someone who lost what we lost and found her way back. They saw clearly what adults made complicated with pride and propriety, and the opinions of women in lavender gloves. Love wasn't mathematics. You couldn't calculate its worth by tallying bank accounts and family names and the measured approval of neighbors who'd never sat on a kitchen floor with 2 grieving children and taught them to remember happiness. I know, he said. His voice was rough. I know she does. He found Sarah in the kitchen, flour on her apron, always flour on her apron. He thought, and the thought made his chest tight with something enormous and tender. She was kneading a final batch of bread, her movements careful, controlled, already distant. The posture of a woman preparing to leave. Her packed bag sat by the back door, small and neat, a quiet resignation in the way its clasp was fastened. Sarah. She turned. She saw his face, saw whatever was written there, because she was a woman who read people the way other people read books, and her hands went still in the dough. "I'm a wealthy man," Jonathan said. "I've got more land and cattle than anyone in this county. I could buy just about anything I set my mind to." He paused. His hand went to his vest pocket and found the ring, warm, waiting. But my daughters were dying inside. Sarah. 8 months of silence. 8 months of watching them disappear into a place I couldn't reach, no matter how hard I tried or how much I spent. He took a step closer. His voice broke on the next words, and he let it break. Because some truths are too big for a steady voice. You brought them back to life. You walked into this house with nothing but a thin coat and your husband's recipe, and you sat on my kitchen floor, and you gave my girls something I couldn't give them. You gave them someone who understood. He held out Catherine's ring, that small gold circle resting in his broad, calloused palm. Class means nothing compared to that. Money means nothing. What this town thinks means nothing. Will you marry us? Not me. Us. Because this had always been a family asking. Sarah looked at the ring in his open hand. She looked at this man proud, weeping, stripped of every pretense, standing in his dead wife's kitchen, asking a poor widow to save him the same way she'd saved his children. She thought about Miguel. She thought about what he would say if he could see her now. And she knew with the certainty of a woman who had loved well and been loved well in return, that he would say, "Go on. Mi vida, there's room in your heart. There's always been room." "Yes," she said, "I will marry all three of you." From the hallway came the sound of small feet on floorboards, fast and careless. And then the twins burst through the kitchen doorway. They'd been pressed against the wall, with their ears to the plaster, listening with the focused intensity only children can sustain. And they crashed into Sarah first, then Jonathan. Then all four of them were tangled together beside the warm stove, laughing and crying and holding on. The cookie jar sat on the shelf behind them, full, permanent. Home. The cookie jar. They married in April, when the apple trees along the creek bloomed white and pink, and the whole valley smelled like promises keeping themselves. It was a simple ceremony, the ranch hands scrubbed clean and wearing their Sunday best, a handful of good neighbors, the minister from the Methodist Church who kept his remarks short because he could see that everything important had already been said in a kitchen 6 weeks earlier. Mrs. Caldwell did not attend. Nobody mentioned her absence, and nobody missed her presence. The twins scattered flower petals down the makeshift aisle between rows of wooden chairs set up in the yard, real wildflowers they'd picked that morning from the meadow behind the barn, purple lupine and yellow buttercups and tiny white daisies that got tangled in their hair. They took this duty with tremendous seriousness, placing each petal with the care of artists completing their finest work. Sarah wore a cream-colored dress she'd sewn herself, simple and clean-lined, with Catherine's cameo brooch at her throat, a gift from Jonathan that morning, offered with the words, "She would have wanted you to have it. She would have loved you for what you've done." Sarah had held the brooch in her palm for a long time before pinning it on, understanding the weight of what it meant to be welcomed, not as a replacement, but as a continuation. When the minister pronounced them married, the twins cheered louder than the entire congregation combined, and Bill Hensley blew his nose into a bandana the size of a dinner napkin, and even Mrs. Avery was seen dabbing her eyes with her apron corner while pretending she had flour in them. That evening, after the guests had gone home and the girls were asleep in their beds, with wildflowers still in their hair and smiles still on their dreaming faces, Sarah stood in the kitchen and filled the cookie jar. Fresh sugar cookies with cinnamon on top, Catherine's recipe, which Emma had dictated from memory weeks ago, precise about the measurements and passionate about the cinnamon. Beside them, a few of Miguel's Mexican wedding cookies, powdered sugar dusting their rounded tops like tiny snow-covered hills. 2 recipes, 2 loves remembered, 1 jar holding them both. Jonathan leaned against the kitchen doorframe, the same doorframe he'd gripped with white knuckles on Valentine's Day, the same spot where he'd wept at the sound of laughter he'd been afraid he'd never hear again. "It was never really about the cookies, was it?" he said quietly. Sarah placed the chipped lid on the jar and settled it just so. She turned to him with that smile, the one that held sorrow and joy in the same breath, that knew the cost of loss and the worth of second chances. "It was always about the cookies," she said, and he understood that they were both exactly right. Now, folks out here have a saying, you measure a man's wealth not by the size of his herd, but by what he builds that outlasts him. Jonathan Pierce was the richest man in the territory by any standard the bank cared to apply. But the thing that made him truly wealthy, it cost nothing at all. Just a poor widow, some flour, and a heart big enough to heal 2 little girls who'd forgotten how to smile. Years passed the way years do out here, quietly, fully, marked by seasons and harvests and the ordinary miracles that accumulate into a life. The Pierce Ranch prospered. The twins grew tall and strong and kind in the way that children grow when they are loved without condition and taught by example that grief is not the end of the story, but the place where a new chapter begins. Rose became a teacher at the Calder County Schoolhouse. With her mother, Sarah's patience, and her birth mother, Catherine's gentle voice, she married a quiet man who read poetry and understood that Rose sometimes needed to stand at the window and watched the sun rise in silence, remembering things from before. Emma married a carpenter from town and built her life around a kitchen that smelled, always, of sugar and cinnamon. One autumn afternoon, years and years after a Valentine's Day that changed everything, Emma stood at the familiar table in the Pierce Ranch kitchen, older now, laugh lines framing her dark eyes, teaching her daughter to press heart-shaped cookie cutters into pale dough. The blue ceramic jar sat on the same high shelf where it had always sat. Its lid was chipped in two places now, and the painted yellow flowers had faded to ghosts of themselves. But the jar was full. It had not been empty in over 20 years. Rose came through the door with her own children tumbling ahead of her, coats still on, hands already reaching for the flower jar, voices high and happy and loud, the kitchen filled with noise and motion and the sweet, warm smell of something baking. Rose watched her sister guide her niece's small hands on the rolling pin and said softly, almost to herself, the words that had traveled down through all those years, like water through stone, shaping everything, wearing nothing away. He'd want me to remember the happy times, not just cry. Emma looked up and smiled. She taught us that. She taught us everything that mattered. Outside, the first autumn frost was touching the window panes, drawing its delicate patterns on the glass. But inside, the kitchen was warm. The cookie jar was full. Two recipes lived side by side under that chipped blue lid, and the laughter of children, Catherine's grandchildren, Sarah's grandchildren, the living legacy of a Valentine's Day when a poor widow sat on a kitchen floor and unlocked two frozen hearts with nothing but flour and honesty and love echoed through every room. The house wasn't quiet anymore. It hadn't been quiet in a very long time. And that, I reckon, is the story of how a heart-shaped cookie saved a family. But it's really about something bigger than that. It's about how the most valuable things in this world don't cost a single cent, and how sometimes the people who have the least to give end up giving you everything you never knew you needed. The sound of your children smiling, that's worth more than all the gold in the territory. And Jonathan Pierce, God rest him, would have been the first to tell you so.